Do I think the board is going to be dictating to Farage how he should lead the party? No, I don't. Neither do I think it should do.
Yes.
So the board is there to help, to support the leader in carrying out his tasks. In Britain, we respect democracy, and if we were to have a referendum and it came with a result, that would be it, and we would deliver the result of that referendum. Stark view of the impact the government can have in obstructing small businesses and their ability to create jobs and prosperity in local communities.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to Nick Talks. This episode's face-to-face guest is a gentleman you may not have heard of, but you will going forward. It's Nick Goulding, and he's standing for Reform UK to be part of their, is it panel committee?
The board.
The board. So we're going to get into that right now. First of all, Nick.
Good to see you.
Nick.
Yes, again. Well, that's it. At least I won't forget your name.
Exactly. Remember that Jim Davison joke, stand-up he used to do, going, Nick?
Oh, yes. Yeah,
so I mean...
That shows our age, though.
It does, from the early 80s. We've met several times over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
At different events, usually to do with Reform UK and people connected to Reform UK. Let's start by you giving people a little bit flavour of who you are and how you got here today. So a few minutes, because I know you're ex-army, you're a businessman, a little bit of information on that.
Okay. Well, when I left school, I was army barmy. Lots of my family had been in the forces. Both of my grandfathers had joined the Royal Navy as boys. Both had fought in the First World War. One of them was at Jutland on one of the battleships. The other one was on a torpedo boat, although they were called motor launches at the time. He was sunk when he was off Zeebrugge by a flotilla of German destroyers. One of the crew members with him was killed instantly. Another one had his legs chopped by the propellers when they were in the water. He had a nasty time as a prisoner of war. Those nice chaps, the Germans, but they didn't treat him very well. And then in the Second World War, he'd come back and he was in a very senior staff role, responsible for the supply of all of the guns and ammunition to the Royal Navy and procuring them. My other grandfather, after Jutland, got a scholarship for ex-forces to Cambridge, but he was a working class boy from Stoke. His father had been in the ceramic factories, and I can't remember what his actual job title was, but he's the one that have bottom knockers helping them. Anyway, the people who made the molds for the ceramics. And then in the Second World War, he had taken holy orders after the First World War. He'd studied theology at university and then rejoined the Royal Navy as a padre and was on, all of the stuff that the Navy did in the North Atlantic in the Second World War. My father joined the Navy when he was just 17, and he just got in the day the war ended. So he missed the war, but he then had a career in the Navy. So I was born in Hong Kong, where he was a base intelligence officer, taking a bit of time out of the submarines. Then we lived in Scotland and Singapore, where again he was on intelligence, trying to intercept weapons being smuggled in to Borneo, because we had a confrontation with the Indonesians at that time. And so with all that forces background, it was natural I should want to join, but I was a bit of a black sheep, so I was keen on the army, which was probably not what my naval family would have liked, but anyway, I was keen on the army. So when I left school, I went off and I did a short period of time with the Coldstream Guards, and then went to university. I came out having done a degree in politics and then another degree in a master's degree in computer science. And I then went back to the army, to the Gloucestershire Regiment, where I served principally in Berlin. After I finished with that, my conundrum was that I was interested in politics, and I wanted to do something that was politically engaged, not capital P, but small p politics. And it was suggested that I go and look for a job representing small businesses being the bedrock of the economy. And I must confess that at that time I knew nothing about small businesses, and although I'd done a degree in politics, pretty much not much about politics as well. So I then spent 2 parallel careers. I remained in the Territorial Army, and I'll come back to that in a second, but I also had this career as a lobbyist for small businesses for the next 20 years. And that took me to Brussels and to Edinburgh, Cardiff, as well as Westminster and Whitehall, but at the same time engaging with small business owners up and down the country to understand their concerns and priorities, which I got really when people were having difficulties. So I got a pretty stark view of the impact the government can have in obstructing small businesses and their ability to create jobs and prosperity in local communities. We were quite successful in getting a number of changes. They tended to be relatively detailed. So, for example, the one I always like, because it was short, sharp and to the point, was brandy butter. Now, not something that you think is really going to be impacted too much, but actually back in the early 2000s, the European Union was bringing in I can't remember, is the 3rd, 4th or the 5th directive, butterfat directives. And this exciting instrument determined what could or couldn't be called butter, which seems to make some sense. I mean, you shouldn't go around calling something butter if it isn't butter. But as anyone who makes brandy butter at home will know, there's a lot more sugar in it than there is butter. And so one of our members from Cumbria, who made traditional brandy butter, such as you might make at home in the kitchen, came to us and said, we've just found out that a new law is coming in so that we are not going to be allowed to call our brandy butter. We'll have to call it brandy butterfat derivative or something like that. And the same will apply to the WI, maybe, who have brandy butter that they produce. They won't be allowed to call it brandy butter either. But spookily enough, the big firms like Kraft and St. Ivel, who produce a refrigerated product, because there are slightly different percentages, if you produce a refrigerated product rather than an ambient temperature product, will be able to continue describing theirs as brandy butter. And I then said that can't be right. So I went and spoke to the government, and it turns out that the only people they'd consulted were Kraft and St. Ivel and the other big producers, who, spookily enough, were going to be able to continue calling their product brandy butter.
While at the same time putting their competition out.
At the same time putting the small business competition out. Yeah. And we're very sorry about this, but we've now passed the date at which we can change it, because there was a deadline for derivations, because the directive did have provision in it where there were traditional products to say that, okay, these ones are exempt because they've been around for a long time and there's established sort of practice with them. And, the French, for example, have a product that has even less butter in it called beurre d'enchive, or anchovy butter. And they had theirs on the list, so they were going to be able to continue calling it that, but sadly not us. But sadly for the big businesses that were trying to carve things up, I did know people in the Commission, and the European Commission, that is, and I went to them and I said, look, this is going to make, bendy bananas look stupid. When this goes out in the papers here, you are going to make the European Union look like a laughingstock. And to be fair, they saw sense. And again, although I was for Brexit, I have to say that a lot of the things that were put down at the door of the European Union, as we are now discovering, were not the fault of the European Union, but almost entirely the fault of our own dear government and our own dear officials, who used the European Commission and the European institutions as a shield to protect themselves from all the stupidity that they decided to bring in themselves. Anyway, the Commission said to me, well, although we're past the deadline, we'd be quite happy to accept a late entry from the British government, as long as none of the other member states object, which we don't expect they will. So I went back to the UK government and said, who clearly hadn't bothered at all. And I said to them, well, look, the fact is, I've spoken to the Commission. Here's the name of the official. Here's the name of the directorate. They will accept a late derogation. And I'm going to write to you. And if you don't apply for the derogation, I will be publishing that in the Daily Mail and the Daily Express and so on and so forth. And so reluctantly, they did send in this application for a late derogation. I also networked with other small business organisations in other member states to ensure that there was no objection and that the other member states came back quickly. And no other member state had the slightest problem with that. And so the Commission accepted the late request for an addition to the derogation. And consequently, we were able to continue calling traditional brandy butter. Now, all of this stuff was done behind the scenes. I couldn't take it to the press at that stage because I was holding that in reserve. And if it had become contentious, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
But that's the way in which we managed to influence decisions. But there are two things in that are important. Again, I think this will crop up later. But one is having information. If you know what's going on, you can get something done where the argument is on your side. If you don't have it, you can't get it done. And secondly, you have to have access. You need to know the people that you need to speak to. And if you don't know the people that you need to speak to and you can't phone them up and get a hearing, then you're not going to achieve anything. And armed with those things, it is incredible what you can achieve. And there are other examples of the same sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. People do business with people.
That's right. Very much so.
If you can pick up the phone and speak to people, 9 times out of 10, you will find a way through the problem. If you know the person, you can speak to them. Because most people are not trying to put other businesses out of business. They're focusing on what they're trying to achieve. And sometimes they don't understand the impact on someone else and are quite willing to bend to stop other people from suffering. What you just described there reminds me of an episode of Yes, Prime Minister.
Yeah.
With the offal tube, which is basically a British sausage. You couldn't call a sausage anymore. And it sounds comedic, but Yes, Prime Minister was based on the workings of government, especially connected to the EU. So well done for the brandy butter. Let's jump to politics. You were a member of the Brexit Party?
Yes, but before that, I have to confess, to my deep shame, I was a member of the Conservative Party for a long time. When I first got in, I had all sorts of aspirations of applying to be an MP and so on. But when I started to discover more about what you had to sign up to and so on, I rather lost the appetite for that. And anyway, my politics was small p politics. And had I been really pushing the Conservative brand, it would have made it harder for me in influencing the Labour Party, particularly, but also the Liberal Democrats. And I was quite successful in getting stuff into the Labour Party manifesto in 1997, because if you present a good case to people, they will pick it up. I had become...
Give us an example of that.
Well, the key example of that was the commitment to statutory right to interest in late paid commercial debt, where the legislation they brought forward was in fact drafted by parliamentary draftsmen working for me and for my organisation, that the Labour Party picked up and brought in almost word for word. Now, in that particular case, and this was working with Barbara Roche, who was the Small Firms Minister at the time. She had been the shadow. And there's a massive difference between the Labour Party approach 1997 and the way they approached to 2024. In 1997, they were ready for it in every way, and they were really focused on the detail. Now, I don't agree with a lot of things they did. I particularly don't agree with a lot of their constitutional changes, which I think have been the root of the ruin of the country. But you can't fault them for that political preparation for power in 97 and the way they approached it. And you've heard Nigel Farage say how we need to learn from the Liberal Democrats when it comes to local politics, to how you actually go around knocking on doors and winning seats. And quite rightly, because the Liberal Democrats do focus on that. But equally, I think we can learn from New Labour, not New Labour policies, but the New Labour approach to understanding the detail of policy, to engaging with the people. You don't have to agree with all of them, but you do need to engage with the people that have got a dog in a particular fight so that you understand what everything is. And then when you come to power, you're equipped with the information to actually put through legislation that makes sense because you've been consulting about it for a considerable time before the general election. And that was the case with the introduction of legislation to apply a statutory right to interest on late paid commercial debts, which, as I said, was something that we'd been pushing for a long time and had got the Labour Party to put in their manifesto, and then provided them, oh, look, here's some ready-made legislation that you can put in. Well, that's just what they want, because there's lots of stuff you can't do straight away. So if somebody hands you a bit of legislation and it's written and all you've got to do is tidy it up with the civil service and put it in, well, that's a win-win as far as they're concerned. But we'd also not relied on the Labour Party, because at the same time, we'd been pushing the same policy with the European Commission, blindsiding the CBI that was fighting it tooth and nail. And so we got a double win, because A, we got the Labour government to implement it as soon as they got to power, but B, we got a European directive giving exactly the same, in fact, enhanced powers over and above the UK legislation. So sometimes if you follow multiple tracks, they all come home for you at the same time.
Exactly. Not every track will be a successful track.
That's very true.
You're running several tracks at the same time. You've mentioned Brussels and EU now several times.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you voted for Brexit.
I did vote for Brexit.
How did you come to that conclusion, considering you've been working with and alongside European, the EU and things like that?
Well, precisely because I've been working inside and alongside the EU institutions. Now, don't get me wrong, I like a lot of the people there, and there are some well-intentioned people, but the political structure of the European Union, the way it removes ultimate say from member states, was unacceptable to me. I remember when John Major was Prime Minister, and I went to a session in Brussels with representatives from business organisations from member states across the country. And I asked John Major, once he'd finished giving his stuff, is how he suggested that we deal with the ratchet effect, where it's the same as democracy in Africa. It's one man, one vote once. And in the same way with the European Union, you agree it once and you can never get out of it. So one government could agree something, and then a new government could be elected on a clear mandate to reverse that policy, but have absolutely no power to do so. And there are various other ways in which the democratic deficit would apply, but that was the most stark one. And I also thought that while it was possible, like Johnson did with his 2 articles, to make a case for continuing in the European Union as it was at that precise point, I mean, I would have thought the balance was for leaving, but you could argue it either way. The fact was the direction of travel of the European Union was deeply contrary to UK national interests. And while you might have made the case at the time of the referendum, in 10 years' time, the European Union would have advanced on all fronts in a way that wouldn't have been acceptable to us. So if you're going to leave eventually, you might as well leave now and get the pain out of the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I have to say, massively underestimated the Ramona response. I remember I don't know if you remember, but after the Lisbon Treaty, both, and I may have got some of these, like the French rejected it, the Irish rejected it, and the Dutch rejected it. And in every case, they either just ignored it and carried on, or they had a referendum which they then ignored. In the Irish case, they had a referendum and got the wrong result, so they had another referendum until they got the right result. And I remember holding forth, and this must have been in about 2006-ish, to assembled European types, that, well, of course, in Britain, we respect democracy. And if we were to have a referendum and it came with a result, that would be it. And we would deliver the result of that referendum. How wrong I was about that. Because at the time of our referendum, I did a little bit in the referendum campaign. I went and spoke in a few places for an organisation called Business for Breakfast. No, but Business for Brexit, I should say, not for well, for breakfast as well, because I think they was typically at breakfast meetings to catch the business owners. So it's Businesses for Business Brexit, Businesses for Breakfast Brexit.
Right.
Anyway, something along those lines. But that was about all that I did.
Yeah.
The thing that fired me up was the response of the Ramonas,
Yeah.
their attempt to overturn a democratic decision by the British people. And what was even more shocking is the way in which so many of those people were embedded in the Conservative Party and were happy to work with all sorts of other people from across the political spectrum to stymie Brexit. I think the Speaker of the House of Commons needs to bear particular responsibility for that stupidity. But a lot of the ministers weren't exactly full-throated for delivering Brexit. Yeah. They were happy to, cave on this or cave on that.
The whole establishment.
The whole establishment.
From the mainstream media to universities to
everything.
Leaders of the big businesses to every political party. It was a disgraceful part of our history where they wanted to reject the largest democratic vote ever held in this country. I had friends who voted to remain in the EU for their own reasons. And everyone I knew who voted for Remain said to me afterwards, this is disgraceful. And I would vote Brexit now because we've come out and we need to come out, because otherwise what are we voting for? And I think it changed the psyche of the country.
Well, it did. I encountered many people such as that. And I've got no problem at all with people who voted to Remain.
I haven't.
I think that was
their right.
Yeah, that was a democratic choice.
They just wanted a different vision of the UK to me. But that's called democracy, and they're entitled to that view.
Definitely. I 100% agree with that. Yeah. The people, so I make a distinction between Remainers and Ramonas.
Yes.
Remainers are fine.
Mm.
Okay, hopefully they see the error of their ways, but you think that with anyone who disagrees with you politically. Yeah. But I wouldn't say it any stronger than that.
Yeah.
The Ramonas are an unacceptable part of our political debate, because if you cannot accept that you've lost something through the democratic process, then you are a problem for democracy. And I think they are a problem for democracy. I think they've been a problem for democracy for longer than I care to think.
Yes.
But one of the good things about that whole Ramona thing is the scales dropped from my eyes as to how deeply flawed so much of the establishment was in this regard, how deeply they disregarded the views of the population as expressed through the democratic process.
I'd go one step further. I'd say how much they dislike a certain sector of their fellow citizens, because it was palpable. The visceral hatred of people who could dare vote to leave the EU. You were evil, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi. You only voted that way because you're stupid, you don't have a degree. You're that stupid that Russian bots convince you to leave the EU. The way they treated a large part of our fellow citizens was absolutely disgraceful.
Oh, I entirely agree. And I am sad to have to confess that a large part of my family fall into that category. I mean, I went to a top public school. Most of my family and, their friends and relatives fall precisely into the category of person who has gone down that wrong path. And although there is a sound minority from that community who don't feel like that, there are too many of them who do. So I am under strict orders not to engage with this sort of debate when I'm in family gatherings, to keep harmony and peace underway. And I do, unless they start it. But if they start it, then they get it back.
Yeah. I'm exactly the same with my family and friends. I don't talk politics with my family and friends unless they want to talk to me about politics, and then let's talk about politics. But I never raise it because it's unfair. Because it's a family get-together. We don't need to be discussing things like that. Right, let's move on to, you joined Reform UK.
Yes, on the back of the Ramona push after the referendum.
And then Reform have gone...
So it was the Brexit Party, not Reform UK. I joined the Brexit Party that later became Reform UK.
Which then became Reform UK. Reform UK was a micro party for many years. And then it exploded last year Nigel Farage came back. We had the general election. They won 5 seats, which doesn't sound a lot, but it was the biggest surprise of my lifetime that a party that nobody thought would win anything wins 5 parliamentary seats. And it's very hard for small parties to win any seats in our system, and they won 5. Since then, they're doing well in the polls. They're leading all the main parties now. If there was an election today, it looks like we'd have a Reform majority in the House of Commons again, which is just shocking how quickly this has happened. One of the criticisms of Reform has been it's not a democratic party. Now, this has been looked at and it's being changed, so it is. I'm presuming part of this is to have a board.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a board that sits above the leader, and is going to be involving making policy in the direction of the party. And you're standing to sit on that board. Can you take a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was above the leader.
Right.
I would say that no party, certainly no party that's politically successful, is fully democratic in the way you imply. And the reason for that is you have to have cohesion if you're going to win. You need to have a leader, be you Reform or Conservative or Labour. And if you have a leader who is not a leader and where everyone pulls in different directions, like Michael Foot, like to a lesser extent Kinnock, although he was trying to apply discipline, it was work in progress in the rather anarchic Labour Party of the time. And then you come to Tony Blair, and he did impose discipline. He had some headline things like scrapping Clause 4, and that was to show that he was in charge, which it did do.
Yeah.
Of course, the Labour Party have a National Executive Committee, but the reality is, okay, there might be some elected members of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, but the vast bulk of them are determined by the leader and his office. The same, rather more behind the scenes, is true of the Conservative Party. The leader controls it. As a ordinary member of the Conservative Party, you have less than no say in the policies of the Conservative Party. And that's obviously proven because if the membership of the Conservative Party had had a say in their policies for the last 20 years would look nothing like the policies that they did implement.
Yeah.
The only times they have had a say, when they've allowed a leadership election, they've managed to elect someone erratic as far as the blob is concerned. So they elect Liz Truss, who is ejected and then not followed by any choice for the ordinary party members to have a say, and that's very deliberately so. You get Theresa May coming in without any competition that gets as far as the party members. So the first point I'd make is everyone who makes this criticism is a useful fool. They are falling into the trap of the strong forces that are attempting to block Reform's progress. And they come from across the establishment. Now, even though their own parties don't allow any such say, they see that because the sort of people who support Reform want to not repeat the mistakes of the past, they want to see some sort of democratic bit, that is a useful wedge that they can use to help undermine Reform. So every time someone repeats that argument, they are advancing an argument that is put by the forces that are trying to block change. And so I would say to any of your listeners who I know are probably harder line than me on many things, that they should think very carefully before, in that old phrase, they become the useful fool, the tool of the enemy, because that's precisely what you're doing. And don't underestimate the nefarious way in which our enemies will seek to undermine us by internal discord. And they will do it through all sorts of unexpected routes. And you should be open to the fact that arguments you think are coming from the right are in fact coming from the blob because they think it will undermine our ability to move forward.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure there's meetings going on now in Whitehall, in Westminster, a weekly meeting right now about have we damaged reform any more than we damaged them last week?
Yeah.
And if not, why haven't we damaged them more up to now? Because obviously reform is a huge threat, not just to the political parties, but the way we've been doing business in this country for 20, 30 years. The establishment committed a coup d'etat on Liz Truss. Get rid of her because, we don't like some of the things she's saying.
I mean, she wasn't very clever about the way she went about things, to be fair.
Absolutely.
She didn't emulate Margaret Thatcher, who didn't come in, contrary to current opinion, did not come in with all guns blazing. She came in with a limited agenda that was well thought through and was able to deliver it step by step as she meant it to her position, because the Conservative Party at that time, for those that are old enough to remember it, was full of wets, was full of people who really couldn't stand her and what she stood for, which was, again, securing the change to get out of the calamity that we've been suffering in the 60s and particularly the 1970s with the IMF and so on and so forth. But there were too many Conservatives then who were perfectly happy with the status quo. And because Margaret Thatcher, love her or hate her, was an agent for disrupting the establishment, they wanted to stop her in the same way. But she was cleverer than Liz Truss, and they never got the chance to kick her out until much later in the process.
Isn't the fact that nearly all our politicians now in Westminster are not of the calibre they used to be 30, 40, 50 years ago? The people who should go into politics, the people who should be ministers, the people who should be PMs, go into banking and finance because they don't see politics as the reward it once was. And therefore, we've got Class B politicians.
Well, I'm not convinced that all the MPs back in the 50s, 60s and 70s were these outstanding examples that
sure it wasn't all
that you're suggesting. What I would say is that their experience and their cultural expectations were much more aligned with the electorate. So their natural inclination as a body was much more in line with what the country wanted, because the big change isn't so much the caliber of the MPs on average, because to be fair, some of the MPs we have at the moment are, intellectually speaking, perfectly capable. It's just they're wrong-headed in what they're trying to pursue, which is a different question. And back in the day, they weren't sucked into a collective blob where they all go to the same university. They all go straight in. I mean, I exaggerate, but a large proportion of them go into political leaning jobs. They may be political advisors. They may be working in the research departments. They might be working for an organization which is on the periphery, like a trade union in a policy sense, if they're on the Labour side.
On the career.
Yeah, it has become a career. And I have to say that I was right amongst that when I was working as a lobbyist. In fact, you'd have probably recognized me as part of that same blob at the time. It's just my views, which I, to a large part, kept to myself, were not in line with everyone that I was speaking to. And from when I first started doing that sort of thing to when I left, actually, it became worse and worse and worse. Sometimes it does become useful to be able to dredge out memories from that case. I mean, I remember when Ed Davey was working in the Whip's office doing policy research for the Liberal Democrats. Now, the reason that he was working in the Whip's office was because the Liberal Democrats didn't have so much money then, and they couldn't afford to fund their research department outside Parliament. So they used someone working inside Parliament to do it. Now, if you look at the complaints that were made about Marine Le Pen misusing the European Parliament budget, and I see that now some people, particularly on the right, some of the same people who listen to your podcast have been starting saying, well, there's evidence that when Farage was in Europe, that UKIP was misusing the stuff. The fact of the matter is, all of the political parties use the resources that they have inside Parliament to do activities that could be sort of mirrored outside Parliament. It's just that they don't hold it against anyone, except for the ones that they're trying to destroy. And in this particular case, where Mr. Davey was working in the Whip's office, he wasn't working on parliamentary issues. He was working on general policy. The other nice thing about that is, I mean, I used to go out drinking with him at the time, and he was perfectly decent. Well, as you can see from all of his little films, he's a perfectly fun guy to go out for a drink with. But we were doing some research into an alternative to rates at the time called land value taxation, and a lot of work was put into that. And at the end of that process, it became quite apparent that actually, for all sorts of practical reasons, it wasn't a workable policy. And so the Liberal Democrats at that point quietly dropped it. But by the last election, they'd come back to promoting this land value taxation, because some later generation of Liberal Democrats had completely forgotten that they'd actually been through it sort of 20 years before and worked out that it wasn't going to work. So when I was at hustings and I was able to point out that their leader had been part of a working group that had rejected it back 20 years before, it did rather floor the Liberal Democrats. So sometimes tucking these little bits of information away can come back to help you. And the fact is, he was being used in precisely the same way as Marie Le Pen was using her staffers to work on stuff in France. And exactly the same way that UKIP used the European Parliament employed staff to work on policies. And frankly, I don't think it's wrong, particularly because opposition parties have only a fraction of the resources that government parties have available to them. So I'm not criticizing them for doing that. I'm saying that what is hypocritical is, on the one hand, doing it yourself, and on the other hand, allowing the forces of the media to go at a different party because they don't happen to like them at the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what they're trying to get out of that is the headline that has the word Reform UK or UKIP or whatever, and the word fraud. Because then most people then won't read the article and they jump to the conclusion you're stealing money, where it had nothing to do with stealing money. It was to do with using resources in technically a way that you shouldn't be using resources. That's a big difference to actually stealing money.
Definitely.
Because to begin with, I thought Le Pen was being charged with stealing millions.
No.
And then when you read the article, this is more of a technical issue of what so, but they just want the headline. Let's jump back to the board. So tell me about the board. Why are you for Reform UK setting a board up? Who's going to be on the board? How many people will be on the board? How many people are going to be voted for to be on the board?
On the board, there will be a majority who are directly appointed by the leader. There's the leader and the deputy leader, and I think 3, it might be 4. Anyway, a small number of other slots which are directly appointed by the leader. But as per the party constitution, which Farage brandished at our party conference last year, there is this provision that there should be 3 who are directly elected by the members. Now, do I think the board is going to be dictating to Farage how he should lead the party? No, I don't. Neither do I think it should do. Because I think that
that's why you have a leader. That's why it's called leader.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the board is there to help, to support the leader in carrying out his tasks. However, the leader cannot be everywhere, and the leader cannot know everything, just because one person can't. So I don't think that the formal meetings of the board will do anything much other than to support the leader in what he's doing. And I think that's perfectly right. But what these elected board members will have that mean, I think, that they are important is those 2 things I was describing when I was talking about my lobbying experience. They will have information. So they will know what's going on. It'll be hard for the party to deliberately not tell members of the board what's going down. It's just not going to happen. So those members will be privy to the information that they need in order to know what they need to be trying to influence. And the second thing that they will have is access, because again, it's difficult to believe that anyone, however high they are in the party, is not going to talk to one of the board members if they need to have a discussion. And as I demonstrated with Brandy Butter, the two things you need to influence things are information that something needs looking at and access. So if you have information and access and coming at it from a constructive view, you can actually make the changes that are wanted. Not because you're forcing them on people, but because it's in their interest and the interest of the party to achieve that thing. And I should say that where I start from is that forget all the noise that you see. I and we should be 100% focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is delivering a majority reform government in 2028 or 2029. Because it's only by having a majority reform government with an absolute majority in the House of Commons that we can make the change. And forget about, in a way, the House of Commons, because the House of Commons has been undermined by the way in which Blair and then Cameron have sort of messed around with the Constitution. It's changing the civil service, changing the judiciary, so that we restore them to the subservient position vis-a-vis the elected members that they always had in the past and should be restored again. So that if the elected government wants to proceed with something, the civil service should be there to facilitate it. Yes, point out where there are pitfalls and practicalities and so on, but in a constructive way. And likewise, the judiciary, who have decided that they're an independent source of power and that they can determine what governments do, and that's their collective judgment, they have got that completely wrong. The judiciary is far astray from where it should be, and they need to be brought back to heel. And I say that because they are a destructive force for democracy. The Supreme Court has been a crying disaster the whole way through, precisely because it is too big for its boots. In the first instance, and this is without saying anything particularly about the House of Lords itself, but I think that the Supreme Court needs to be scrapped and they need to restore the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords so that it comes back into part of Parliament. And secondly, we need to restore the fully functional post of Lord Chancellor, who was, as well as being a senior minister and essentially the Speaker of the House of Lords, was also the head of the judiciary and controlled the Judicial Appointments Commission. And if you do those things and you change a few sort of underlying rules and you put through legislation to remove from precedent everything that has been brought in using precedent from foreign powers, from foreign constitutional agreements, from the European Court of Human Rights, etc., just strike those out of our law so that judges cannot use those as precedent and they can only rely on English and Welsh law in England and Wales and on Scottish law when it comes to decisions pertaining to Scotland. And the only source of their decisions should be English and Welsh, or as it may be, Northern Irish or Scottish legislation. And anything else they should not be allowed to take into account.
That's common sense. How did we get into such a mess that the country's in, that you have to say that, where most people in this country probably think that's how it works now anyway, because that's how it's always worked. But it hasn't worked like that since Tony Blair.
Well, to be fair, although he was the sharpest change, the establishment has been moving in that direction since the early part of the 20th century. Chip by chip, they have moved from the democratic accountability that we need to have. Now, what I've said just there probably doesn't grate too much with the audience that you principally have, but to the establishment, that is revolutionary talk that they will think I am completely out of kilter, and they'll say, oh, he's for sort of destroying democracy and so on, whereas it's precisely the reverse, because they're like Alice through the looking glass. They see everything from completely the wrong end of the telescope, and they have failed to understand that it's their denial of democracy, their denial of our established constitution built up successfully over hundreds of years that meant that Britain was the dominant power and influence across the whole world, that they decided to throw all that lot away because they knew better. Well, clearly they didn't know better, and we need to get them out of that.
I would rather trust 70 million British people to make decisions than I would the European Court or the EU or the WHO or whatever international organisation or legal body you could name. I would rather always rely on 70 million British people to make the rules and decisions that they want to live by, but also knowing that they can change those rules and laws anytime they wish.
Well, the only thing I'm going to disagree with that, because it does illustrate one of the things that's gone badly wrong, is where you say 70 million British people. Because frankly, our population should not be 70 million now. The British people have been betrayed despite their repeated democratic indication on migration, because the only reason we're approaching that 70 million is because of the lies and the deliberate stepping around the wishes of the people that has led to our position now. So I'm not saying we can unbundle all of that, but I guess when we come on to policy, you're going to want to ask me about that particular question. Yeah. But you've just given me a nice segue into migration. Now, many of the people who have come to this country are fine, outstanding, hard-working individuals who want to fit in here. I know many of them. Many of them are members of Reform. I have no problem with them. I think, although I probably wouldn't have let them in the first place myself, I think now they're here and they've demonstrated that they have secured their place as part of our country. The ones that have not, I have a completely different view on. So in particular, where I start from is the Reform policy as set out in the contract that we put out before the last election. So if they're here illegally, or if they came here in the first place illegally, I would have no truck with them. If they arrive, or if they're here and we find them and they're here illegally, I would detain and deport. And that's our policy, is to deport all those people who are here illegally. And there's nothing that's been said from Reform that has reversed back from that. So when you see talk about how, Reform's gone soft and Reform's gone soft on this and soft on that, and Reform's not for mass migration, mass remigration, or however it's described, the fact of the matter is Reform is for removing from this country all the people who are here illegally, all the people who've overstayed their visas and are now here illegally, all the people who've come here perfectly legally but then decided to commit crimes, particularly imprisonable crimes, and particularly violent and sexual crimes. Too many of those have been allowed by the courts, stupidly, to remain here. We will be making sure that those people are removed from the country. Now, that actually does amount to hundreds of thousands of people. We're not for mass deportations, because that sort of language is really, it's incorrect, because it sort of implies you're going to be deporting people as a group, in the same way that the Jews were herded into the ghettos and then the extermination camps in the Second World War. That's the message that people hear. That's why Rupert Lowe was so wrong to start talking about that sort of thing. It's also wrong because he was departing from party discipline. And I'll say a word or two about party discipline again in a moment. But if we're going to be committed to deporting this very large number of people, you might call it mass deportation. I would call it judicial removal from people who have committed a crime. And there's a very big difference to deporting someone because they have done something wrong by arriving here illegally, by committing crimes once they're here, than there is to saying all the people who are of this ethnic origin are going to be deported. Because that doesn't give any agency for them to prove that they are committed to being a proper Briton. Look, for example, some people would have issues with people who come from Somalia, and I can sort of understand why that might be. But look at, what's her name, Aaron Hersey, a better proponent of how things should be in a democratic society, who has taken enormous personal risk to stand up for what she thinks is right. It's hard to imagine. And so if you start talking about Somalis as a group, you'll pick up not only her, but you'll also pick up other Somalis who've got stuck in, who've got themselves a job, who are contributing to society, who are responsible parents and responsible members of society. And I say it's not just to include them when you're talking about groups. You need to look, once they're here, you need to look at individuals and remove individuals who have committed crimes, who refuse to integrate, who continue with practices like marrying their cousins with the deformities and genetic maldevelopment that creates, with the impact that has on our social services, because we have to look after the children who are born that way because their parents chose to follow that tradition and marry within the family cycle, in exactly the same way as the Habsburgs managed to, and indeed the Romanovs with all of their health problems with their royal family. So you can be high up and still suffer from that. And where we've got religious practices where people think it's okay to suggest that someone who's an apostate should be killed, I say the person who thinks that has no place in this country. And I think that our police force, in not actively pursuing the people who have that view, they need to be removed. And I think people who don't have any consideration for other free speech. So if someone decides that, I mean, I wouldn't advocate it myself, but if someone decides to destroy the Quran, that they should be hounded in a way, or even make some accidental thing that fanatics describe is wrong. So this teacher from Yorkshire that's still in hiding because of the death threats that he suffered, the establishment should hang their heads in shame that actually they shouldn't be hiding him. They should be hunting down and expelling from this country all the people from whom that threat is emanating. Because if they're the source of that sort of threat to other people in our society, then they should not be here.
Many of those people will be British citizens and will also have been born in this country. So then that brings a whole new raft of problems about how do we deal with the children of immigrants. Your deportations of, and it will be several hundred of thousands, I don't think it's enough anymore now. I think the public have moved on. I think the term mass deportation might have connotation to Second World War for some people, but for many people now, I think people want to look at everyone you named. Yes, everyone agrees they should be gone. They're illegal. They commit crime. They've not fitted in, and they weren't born here. Deportation. No one's got a problem with that. But I think it goes much more deeper than that now. Anybody who wasn't born here, in my view, is a guest. You're a guest in this country, and I think we should be able to say to guests anytime we like, time you went home, because you're only a guest in this country. I'm not talking about the children who were born here. I'm not talking about going. I'm not talking about a white thing here. If you're not white, you've got to leave. But I think the public have moved on. I think we're going to have to deport, not physically, but I think we're going to have to encourage millions of people to leave this country over so many years. And there's different ways of doing that. But again, at the moment, every other party is saying status quo is perfect. Status quo is perfect. We'll bring 1 million people in a year and that's perfect. At least Reform are going, that stops, and we're going to deport at least some people we don't want. So I'm happy Reform at least have gone beyond the status quo. Let's get back to the board.
Well, no, I should just respond to what you're saying, because I think that removes agency from individuals. And I'd say two things about it. Firstly, there is a range of opinions from people who do support reform, from yours to perhaps close to mine.
Mm.
But at the moment, our key problem is getting Reform elected, because anything else is purely gesture politics. The other thing I would say is I don't think that the politics of this is finished yet. And I think the politics of it will change once we start in a robust way making the changes that Reform is committed to. So I would reserve my judgment on lots of these things until I see what the human response is to the way in which our policies play out. Now, right this second, I would not be for moving on anyone who isn't in the categories that's already described. And I wouldn't be for that, both for reasons of practicality, but also for reasons of humanity. Going forward, you will find that people from these communities will respond to the change of our culture. I think, which is reflected by the political changes and the general sense from the population. Now, I would not be, as we stand here, for deporting the wide range of people you've just described, but they have the opportunity to demonstrate their place in our society once they see those changes going on. And I would expect them to be responding to that. So if they're continuing to promote on their social media jihad, then they're already committing crimes and we should be after them. If they continue to be protesting about school teachers who are being perfectly reasonable and hounding them out of their community, we should be on their case. If, on the other hand, they think to themselves, well, look, I want to stay in this country. I see we have overreached a bit and I need to adapt my behaviour, and more importantly, my children need to adapt their behaviour so they become, and we become, more acceptable members of British society. I wouldn't preclude them from making that choice. In fact, across the spectrum of people, I suspect that a large number of them will make that choice to fit in. One of the reasons that many of them do not do so at the moment, and you can see this in what Aaron Hirson-Ali says, for example, is the pressure they are under from their own communities to conform, even if they don't want to. You can see it particularly with the women who break out and then are killed in honour killings and that sort of stuff. That shows the extent of the pressure those people are under. We need to free them from that coercion so they can come to their own view as to how they need to be fitting in with that society. Now, I take a much more gentle view of how we deal with that, because I don't think we need to go down that route of, let's call it, mass deportation.
Yep.
Because mistakes were made in the past, and we can blame our past government, and we need to hold the Labour Party and the Conservative Party to account for that. We can't, in all conscience, hold that against the people who were told they could come here legally by our legal government of the time. And there's a whole thing about retrospective legislation. Why would we change the rules on people who've made life choices and by that stage will have been here 10, 20, 30 years building up a place? And I just don't think it would be right to say to those people, you've got to leave, unless they're offending in those ways. They are actually engaging in criminal activity. They are coercing other people. They are straightforwardly the problem. Those ones that are the element within their community that are bad uns, that are stopping the rest of their community moving forward, then yes, we need to be taking judicial action against them. And I do think that actually, as they become more absorbed in our society and our culture, that the vast bulk of the people will go with the flow of where pressure is. At the moment, they're bottled in because our multicultural approach has given permission to the bad actors in their part of society to keep that tight control over people. Do you know what? If we make it easier for them, all of those women that are presently held in subjugation by their family will feel more empowered to actually step forward. Those boys from those families who've been brought up here, a percentage of them have gone completely back the other way and they've gone off to fight for Al-Qaeda and so on. But the vast majority of them are getting an education and are going in to fill all sorts of valuable jobs in our society. And so I would kick back at what you're saying by saying that, A, we should not be unfair to individuals. We should call people out where they themselves are bad actors. And yes, we might not wish to have started here, but in politics, you've always started from where you are. And wishing yourself in another place is not an effective way. People can dream what they like to dream, but we have to be practical as to what is deliverable. And I would suggest to you and to the people listening that we need to get real. And we need to know that that part of our society is a part of our society. We can alienate them and we can make them a threat to us. I know you've engaged in debate on things like civil war and so on. We'll only get to that sort of place if we contribute to it as much as they do. We can create the conditions where those parts of our society are distinct from us, or we can create the conditions where we put an arm around them and they're brought into us. But we can only put an arm around them if they are prepared to come the yard the other way. And as I said, many of them would like to do that, but they're not enabled to because we reject them, and they are also kept in control by their own people. So let's see how the people respond when we have a different environment. I think you'll find that most people will go for prosperity for their families, success in life for them. The majority of those elements of our community are no different in wanting the right things for their family than are us. And if we create a narrative which is them and us, that is the way to go down the separation and the deep discord that would be created. So yes, let's get rid of the people who are illegal. Let's get rid of the bad actors, and let's then try to create a cohesive society through integration rather than multiculturalism. And it's that multiculturalism that you can hold at fault for so much of where we are now.
I agree. My biggest criticism of Reform, well, my only criticism of Reform UK is Reform UK is the party we needed 30 years ago to have stopped everything that's gone on. I just think times have moved on. The country's moved on. I think we need different solutions. But I don't want to hark on to that. I want to get back to the board.
Yep.
So how can people vote for you or vote for other people on the board? Is it too late to be a member of Reform UK and still have the right to vote?
Too late for reasons of, as other parties have found, entryism.
Yes, I get that.
There's a 3-month rule.
Yeah.
So anyone who joined, I mean, I'm going to work it out, 3 months before the 14th of August.
So 2 months ago, if you joined before.
Well, 2.5 months ago.
Yeah.
Well, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Anyway, go back 3 months from August. What is it? May, June, July, August. So if you joined by the middle of May, before the middle of May, then you'll have a vote.
Yeah.
And you'll know that because you should receive an email from the party.
Yep.
If you've opted out of emails, you might need to go and actually say, look, I've opted out of emails, but I really want to have this one, please. And you should get an email. You probably have already had an email, I should say. And if you haven't, then you need to flag it up to your branch or to info@reform.
Or check your
Parties
trash
UK.
bin.
Check your spam and so on.
Trash spam.
And look for that. And you should be getting a invitation to join the live stream on the 14th, when all of the, I'd say now, 17 candidates will get a flashingly brief period of time to convince you that they're the right one. And then you've got 7 days in which to vote. And the voting is not being done by Reform UK. It's being done by a third party organisation. It's not, I forget which one they are. It's not the Electoral Reform Society, but it's one of those other bodies that do votes for external people. Like, they do votes for trade unions and votes for so on.
Someone trustworthy.
Someone trustworthy. And that's what they do.
Yeah.
They run ballots.
Yeah.
And you will get a link with them that you can use to cast your vote. And that vote must be cast between the 14th of August and the 21st of August, and we'll know who has made it to the board on about the 23rd of August.
Yeah. Nick, if I was still a member of Reform UK, I would vote for you for these reasons. The first reason is I know you to be an honest man. You speak your mind, you tell it as it is, and I'm sure if you saw things going wrong in Reform UK, I'm sure A, you would try to put it right, and B, if it was that bad, you would tell people about how it's all going wrong if you couldn't fix it and it was like horrendous. And for those reasons, you're the type of person we need on political boards. So I would vote for you if I was a member of Reform UK. Everybody, Nick Goulding, if you're a member of Reform UK, check Nick out and decide who you're going to vote for in a couple of weeks' time.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for coming along today.
My pleasure.